Okay, good morning, everyone. Apologies again for the slightly delayed start. So just to remind ourselves where we were up to, we were exploring the concept of an Issa DeRabbanan or a mitzvah DeRabbanan, rabbinic legislation in brief, and trying to understand what the authority of Chazal was and what was it based. The Rambam adopts a clear answer to this question, and he says that the authority is Torah granted, based on the psukim that we looked at last time, but primarily lo tosor, do not deviate from anything that they teach you, which the Rambam understands to mean both rabbinic interpretation and rabbinic legislation. And the reason the Rambam includes both is paradoxically because of his view that rabbinic interpretation is more creative than we perhaps normally acknowledge or think. Rabbinic interpretation itself is in some respect a human addition or extension or creation, perhaps most accurately, of Torah. And therefore, it's on a spectrum with what we call a takana DeRabbanan, rabbinic legislation, which is completely creative. So we're used to thinking of Torah law interpreted by the sages on one side, rabbinic legislation on the other side, two separate things. But the Rambam sees this much more as a spectrum in which you have at the top, yes, God-given Torah, which generates the process, but then a trickle-down approach in which our interpretation of it and the innovation of rabbinic legislation, new Torah, are simply an extension along a spectrum of ideas. The Rambam and many other Rishonim don't adopt this sort of spectrum model and see interpretation of Torah as something very as simply interpreting the Torah, that's pure Torah law, as opposed to rabbinic legislation, which is pure rabbinic law. And we are left puzzling in their models, so what exactly is the source of authority of DeRabbanans? Now, this question led us to a more profound question, which actually is, what do we mean by authority at all? What do we mean by Torah authority, God-given authority? Now, a common answer often given to this question is, well, of course we need to listen to God. He's God. He's Hashem. He commanded us to do this. But the question is, what do we mean by that? And therefore what? We recognize he's the creator of the universe, he's God, but what is the concept of the leap from that to therefore the idea that I now need to listen to him? Now, sometimes an answer is given that, well, if we don't listen, we'll be punished, fear of punishment, or desire for reward. But even this doesn't seem to explain the concept of authority. It's simply, we have no choice, a bullying tactic. There's no moral superiority in keeping Torah. We're all seeking to maximize pleasure. We know how. We realize if we don't, we will be punished. And if we do so, we will be rewarded. This doesn't seem to give a moral force to the concept of authority. Which, as I said, really brings us to the Euthyphro dilemma, which is found in Plato's dialogue called Euthyphro, in which Socrates asked Euthyphro this question. He asked it in the context of pagan worship, but we can ask it in the context even of monotheism. In our language, the question would be, is it moral because Hashem said it so, or did Hashem say so because it is moral? And this is a dilemma because we find ourselves stuck on the horns of a dilemma because neither option appears that appealing. We could say it is moral because Hashem said so, in which case we would now need to ask, how so? How does Hashem saying so make it moral? Is it at whim? Is there no such thing as absolute morality? Just because Hashem says it's moral, it is moral? Could he have chosen anything else? What makes it moral just because he says this is what needs to be done? What would have happened had he said we should murder? Would that have become moral? So what do we mean when we say because he says so, this becomes moral? The alternative is that Hashem said so because it is moral. But then it would appear that he is constrained by what he is able to say. He's merely reflecting the morality that anyway exists, rather than freely choosing to instruct us in what he wishes us to do. So this is the question, perhaps a question we don't think about a lot. What in fact is the authority of the Torah? If I choose to say I don't wish to listen to it, I may be punished for my choice, but am I in any respect behaving immorally? Now, the answer to this question, the basis of the answer to this question, really leads us to a dismissal of an argument often put forward as evidence for the need for a Torah, and how lost we would be without a Torah. Because often the argument made is that were we not to have a Torah, we would live in a world of moral confusion. There would be no argument we could possibly put to a non-believer in Torah to argue for moral behavior. Anything would go. Without the Torah, there would be no moral structure whatsoever. To the best of my knowledge, such an argument is not found in any classic sources. I may be wrong. And indeed, I don't think is a good argument. In fact, if we look in the Torah seems to have moral arguments, moral complaints, moral expectations pre-Matan Torah. The Torah in the stories of Bereshis turns to the figures in the Mabul who engage in chomos, in violence and theft, turns to the generation of the Dor HaFloga, it turns to a Paro and a Sodom, and calls out all these societies for immoral behavior. A person from Sodom, a person from the generation of the flood, a Paro, is not entitled to reply, well, what do you mean? I haven't been given a Torah. And without a Torah, moral relativism reigns supreme. My morality argues that this is okay. The Torah has expectation of moral behavior above and beyond the Torah itself. A Paro uncommanded in the Torah is still expected to treat, in the words of the Rambam, to treat visitors, immigrants to his land with some basic standard of decency. A Sodom is still expected to engage in some care for the vulnerable stranger that turns up at its gates. A Noachide, a Mabul generation, is expected to behave in a moral manner towards those who are vulnerable and weak and not create a society in which might is right. So there are moral expectations above and beyond the Torah. And interestingly, I would argue that actually we have the whole equation turned on its head. Because the answer to the question as to what gives authority to the Torah and to Hashem is morality. Morality exists beyond the Torah itself. The explanation given by the Rishonim as to why we should keep the Torah is because there is a moral obligation to do so. Whether the moral obligation is appreciation, we accept that we live in a world owned by Hashem, whether the moral obligation is because we have accepted upon ourselves the Torah, but there's a moral obligation once we have accepted the Torah and committed to it, or even without that, because we live in a world owned by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or because we should have appreciation for the gift of life granted to us. It is the moral obligation that gives the authority to the Torah, rather than the Torah giving authority to moral obligation. Which means to say that, in a sense, morality exists independent of the Torah. Where would morality come from? Well, ultimately, the same as everything that exists in creation. It is surely a concept that is intertwined with the fabric of creation. And just like inherent in a creation, once we live in a post-creation world, logic reigns and concepts of the material universe reign, similarly, morality reigns. It is a concept bound up, to the best of our understanding, with the fabric of creation itself. To put this differently and talking about a concept that perhaps we finds a little easier, we have seen already the thoughts of Rav Sadia Gaon that Hashem is bound by logic, meaning to say he can't create a square triangle or can't beat the equation that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Now, beyond creation, pre-creation, we don't have a vocabulary to consider. And in that world, we can't really ask questions about does logic exist or does morality exist, because this is a world pre even our power to reason, even our power to use words. This is words of God alone, infinity alone. There's a breakdown in our ability to talk about, much like in science, there's a singularity. But post-creation, we can say that we now live in a universe in which a square triangle is simply a concept that carries no meaning, and therefore it isn't feasible even for God to do. The phrase a square triangle carries no content. A square is a meaningful term. A triangle is a meaningful term. A square triangle is a contradiction in terms. It has no content to it, and therefore simply is a meaningless expression. And as such, in Rasadi Gan's thinking, not problematic to say that God is bound by this. Similarly, morality. Morality is something that seems to us to be a fundamental building block of reason. It's not logical to be moral, it is moral to be moral. It is a self-contained concept. We can't conceive of the possibility that torturing a small child for fun could be moral. We can conceive of the possibility that causing a child pain for a reason, a medical procedure or the like, is moral. But torturing a small child for fun, instrumentalizing a human being in that manner, we simply can't conceive of as reasonable. And therefore it defies reason to consider the possibility, to consider immoral behavior. It's a different sort of reason. It's technically possible, but it would be immoral to do so. And therefore morality seems to be one of the concepts intrinsic to the fabric of the universe. And as such, in that sense, precedes the authority of the Torah. Post-morality, given that morality exists, now we can ask what's the authority of the Torah? And the answer is because it is moral and appropriate to listen to the Torah for one of various arguments put forward, either because we have accepted upon ourselves the authority of the Torah in the covenantal contract that we entered into with Hashem, or because we owe him the commitment of ownership or appreciation. Now, I've been asked on the side, surely squares and triangles are absolutes, but moral standards can change. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that simple. The application of moral standards can change. Our understanding of morality can change, much like our understanding of much of the universe can change. I'm not arguing that human beings always have certainty about how to behave morally. Of course we don't. Of course we can argue about this. Much as science has been argued about over the generations. Just because humans are incapable of arriving at clarity in a particular generation around a scientific truth doesn't mean there isn't a reality out there. It simply means we may be unable to access it. And it's the same with morality. There's no doubt we humans struggle to arrive at certainty in morality, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a morality out there. It is probably true to say that there are situations where there is a fundamental contradiction between moral principles. That may be the case. And it may be therefore that the application of morality in certain instances becomes a judgment call. Much like there can be contradictions in other forms of reality. There may be conflicting health needs where it gets down to a judgment call as to whether it's worth losing an arm to save a leg or whatever the case may be. But the concept of morality seems to be something fundamental bound up in the fabric of reality. Now, often the claim is put forward, as was put forward in these questions. Someone wrote off group, moral standards can change. Someone wrote on group, if morality is independent or morality can be subjective, what defines or who defines what is moral? And the answer to the question is that ultimately, we human beings need to make judgment calls, difficult judgment calls around these points. I'm not trying to be simplistic here and claim that it is easy to always work out what the morality is in a particular situation. Clearly it isn't easy. Clearly we struggle with this. I'm simply making the claim that there are situations in which there is a moral right or wrong, an absolute moral right or wrong. By the way, this is the intuitive stance. If we adopt the position that there isn't a moral absolute and everything in morality is relative, then anyone can engage in any form of practice that they consider or can argue to be moral, and we don't accept that. We believe that this is intrinsically immoral. It is often claimed that one sees a massive societal difference in morality, and that claim wouldn't appear to be factually correct. All societies, as far as we can understand, have certain basic moral principles. Common ones are the golden mean and an equivalent of haftarah, these sorts of things. I'm not arguing that people always behave in accordance with moral standards. We can choose to ignore our moral voice. We can choose to neglect a moral position, but I don't think it's true to say that there's a complete discrepancy between the moral standards that are arrived at in different societies. There are. Sorry, yes.
Rabbi Zobin, if one takes the position that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, that's the first point.
Yes.
But if you take that position, according to Nefesh HaChaim and the Maharal, they both say that intrinsically in every neshama is the essence of emes, and they don't want to see things that happen which go against the grain, and they should stand up for emes. Now that seems to be part of a DNA that when Hashem created us, all human beings, that if you, as I say, if you take on the point that Hashem has created everyone, within the neshama of a person, it screams out emes. It has to be, and so it seems to be he's pre-programmed us. So if you take on Hashem has created the world, if you take on that premise, it's part of the bria of every human being. That's what Nefesh HaChaim says.
I'm not sure, Leonard, if you are arguing with me or agreeing with me. I simply want to say that you are expressing a origin for where this comes from, and one can put this in Moralian terms and Nefesh HaChaim terms and talk about it something sort of built into the fabric of our neshama. You can put this in philosophical terms and talk about it as the mind. But the reality is, I agree with you. We human beings are capable to some degree or other of accessing truth. Were we unable to access truth, we would be lost. To some degree, we must be capable of accessing truth. And by that, I don't just mean truths around morality, I mean truths around the nature of reality also. Morality, reality, otherwise we wouldn't be able to arrive at scientific truths or truths in belief in Hashem. All of these are truths that we believe we are able to access. I'm simply arguing that moral truth is another truth which we are capable to a degree of accessing. Now, it doesn't mean we have always succeeded in accessing the truth, and it doesn't mean that in any particular time we are capable of arriving at moral answers or truth answers about all questions that we confront. I'm simply saying that we are capable, using reason, to arrive at some truth. And as you say, this in the language of the Kabbalah, one can say this is programmed into the DNA of the neshama. In the language of the philosophers, we can say this is simply a reflection of how the mind works. But whatever vocabulary one chooses, yes, absolutely. We as human beings are, if we are incapable of arriving at any truths, then there's nothing further we can say about creation. And in that case, we've undermined the possibility of belief in God or knowing anything whatsoever. Look, let me give an analogy from other areas of human reason. It may well be that if you lived in the year 1300, you would have absolutely no way of knowing what the moon was made of. And the theory that the moon was a large block of cheese was just as reasonable as the theory that it was a block of rock or a light suspended in the sky. So you would have a wide range of views amongst individuals and societies, with no ability at the time for human reason to determine the answer. Nonetheless, we remain convinced that 700 years on from the year 1300, We are capable. We have now the tools of working this out. And it's exactly the same, well, exactly the same is an exaggeration, but analogous to moral dilemmas. There may well be differences in certain difficult moral situations. There may well be significant disagreements amongst individual humans and societies over certain moral conundrums. There may be cases where we are not equipped to come up with a good answer to a question. Nonetheless, none of that adds up to the conclusion that there's nothing we can say as reasonable and thinking beings about morality. What is the source of our ability as humans to reason? Well, certainly I agree with Leonard's point. Of course, this is something created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in whatever manner and whatever vocabulary one chooses to use to determine creation and reason. But of course, this is part of the universe within which we live. I'm simply arguing that we humans have access to morality. We are able to say something about morality. It doesn't mean we're able to say everything. It doesn't mean we are able to answer all moral questions. It doesn't mean there isn't room for significant disagreement around this, like there's room for significant disagreement about logic or science or other areas in which humans endeavor to access truth. The claim is a minimalistic claim, simply that reason allows us, at least on occasion, to access moral truths. And this is irrespective of the Torah, meaning to say, even were we not to have a Torah, there would still be an expectation on us human beings to have a basic moral standard to the degree to which we can arrive at moral conclusions and to operate in accordance with that. Now, clearly, the Torah's insight offers information which tweaks the moral equation. So, for example, if we take as a moral principle that I shouldn't needlessly end life, for example, we can still say we are lost as to what defines the start and end of life. Does a fetus have, is a fetus alive? What is the balance of suffering versus life such that would justify ending a life of someone in pain, for example? So there are limitations and parameters which the Torah can tweak. Is a fetus alive or not? What point does life start? What point does life end? These are indeed questions which aren't easy to answer and may come down to information that the Torah gives us. So we can have the basic moral premise that I shouldn't end a life and still be very confused around the edges as to what defines a life. The Torah is a player in the moral sphere in that sense. Similarly, our loyalty and debt to Hashem can itself tweak a moral equation. So all else being equal, I may believe that a moral judgment is X, but if I throw into the equation the fact that the creator of the world, to whom I owe the debt of gratitude for my very existence, and who is the owner of the world, wants me to do Y, that itself will shift the balance of the equation. If I'm a guest in someone's house and they ask me to attend supper wearing a suit and a tie, there may be no particular moral quality to wearing suits and ties. Nonetheless, because the host has asked me to do that, that itself gives it a moral force. And similarly, if we view ourselves as guests in God's world, that itself creates moral strength to things which otherwise we refer to as chukim, all else being equal. So this is a suggestion of the relationship between the Torah and morality. And I think we shouldn't fall for the argument that without Torah, there would be no moral code at all. Without Torah, everything would be subjective. Who would define morality? I think there would still be basic moral principles that we can know, though we would struggle, it's correct, we would struggle to know how to apply morality at its edge. Interesting, by the way, that this point is often missed. The degree to which what we think of as moral differences between societies actually are scientific differences between societies. Let me give you an analogy. A surgeon who, again, 300 years ago, engaged in bloodletting to cure someone was not an immoral person. They were making a scientific mistake, which therefore led to them using the moral equation differently. Were we to discover in 100 or 200 years' time that all operations performed on people were as foolish as bloodletting, we wouldn't say that surgeons are engaged in an immoral act. Now, it is true that it turns out that they stuck a knife into someone and cut them for no good reason, if that turns out to be the scientific case. Nonetheless, it doesn't make them immoral in what they are so doing. And it is so with many practices which we label as moral differences, but actually driven by differences in how one understands the world. In Central and Southern America, child sacrifice was fairly common. The Aztecs engaged in child sacrifice, to the best of my knowledge. And my understanding is that this may be seen as an extreme example of a completely different moral universe that they inhabited. But this isn't the case. They believed that if they didn't slaughter X number of children every day, the sun god wouldn't be appeased and the sun wouldn't rise. So they now faced a scientific piece of information that created an incredible moral dilemma. Do you allow yourself to kill children in order to save the world from descending into dark coldness and death of the whole of humanity? And therefore they made the decision, not foreign to the decision made by many societies subsequently, to sacrifice a few innocent civilian bystanders for the sake of survival of society. So these aren't people inhabiting a completely different moral universe. These are people who have a completely different understanding of the reality of the world. Now, what led to that understanding? Quite possibly a corrupt priestly caste. And come up with whichever theory you want. But once you are someone who believes this, and it may be the intelligentsia, the nobility, the ruling family didn't believe this theory, who knows? But they are simply adopting this to engage in power, to maintain power. But the moral equation to society as a whole is similar to the same sorts of moral equations as we would make, given a discrepancy in fact. So all I'm arguing is as follows. Number one, we don't find as wide a range of moral morality as that which is often claimed. The difference between different societies and morality is not as large as is claimed. There are basic moral principles adopted by all societies. Secondly, very often what looks like moral differences are driven by differences in science. And thirdly, just because there are differences doesn't prove that there isn't an ability to get closer or approximate the truth better. In the same way as in science, we understand, just because there are genuine debates and questions we may be unable to answer for now or ever, nonetheless, we don't believe that there isn't an answer out there. In the West, over the last 70 years, we have become ever more cautious, and correctly so, about bold, self-confident moral statements, because we've seen where that can go in totalitarian societies. We've become aware of the danger of overconfident expression of moral certainty. I'm simply saying that we shouldn't let that awareness of danger cause us to swing to the opposite extreme and the conclusion that there's nothing that can be said about morality. Our awareness of the danger simply urges caution, urges epistemological modesty, urges modesty about what we know and don't know, and caution about the certainties we have, and caution about our ability to impose our standards on others. And that is all correct. This is a separate discussion. All I am arguing is that that going too far the opposite way and jumping to the conclusion that nothing can be said about morality is an equal mistake. Just because we need to be cautious doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and claim there's no such thing as morality. Nothing about which we can say any moral voice on whatsoever. And I believe this is in line with our hashkafa also, in which the classic sources, to the best of my knowledge, do not say that morality is impossible without Torah. It can be difficult to have morality without Torah. It can be vaguer. There can be things we don't know, but there's still an expectation of morality on those who don't possess the Torah, like Paro and the Mabul generation, etc. Now, on the group, I've been asked a few questions around this. Does it follow that we're entitled to test the Torah requirements against our or society's basic moral instincts? I want to answer this question with caution, and the answer is yes, to a degree. Again, we should have epistemological modesty and be cautious about what we know or don't know, but I don't think that we should ever switch off our moral compass. And we find this with great thinkers through the generation, with an Avram, He turns to Hashem and says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat," with the Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, who calls HaKadosh Baruch Hu to trial. We need to be cautious about this. We need to be modest about this. This isn't an appeal to moral arrogance and to overconfident assertion of that which we humans can struggle to know. Obviously, we need to recognize a limit to human reason, and also the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the creator of the world, brings a moral voice to this, obviously. But I don't think that means that we should switch off our moral compass completely. I certainly don't think so. I think that's very dangerous. I've also been asked here, is the Torah always moral? Look at, and then there's actually a number of examples given, the Argonos scenario. Look at Yaakov's treatment of Esav over here. In these Sedras. In fact, these Sedras are very interesting because one of the themes being explored, by coincidence, we're learning this as we are learning these Sedras that explore a lot of these questions in terms of Yaakov's treatment of Esav and Lavan and so on and so forth. Now, there's a number of points to be said around each of these, and I don't want to go too far, of course, and get into what really needs to be a series of shiurim about each of those. I will simply make a number of points. First of all, we don't always argue that the others have got everything right. We are capable of admitting to failure in others. Secondly, not always is truth an absolute a value that isn't and can't be conflicted by other moral equations. I've already acknowledged that morality can lead to contradictory views, much like in medicine. One can have a question about whether to amputate a limb to save a life. One of the classic examples dating back to Socrates is, can one tell a lie in order to save a life? I would argue that this is analogous to a medical dilemma of that sort. Of course, telling a lie is a moral failure, but it can be counteracted by greater moral considerations. And Yaakov, who is interestingly held up by the Torah as a paradigm of honesty, titain emes liYaakov, emet, truth is a midah, a quality of Yaakov, found himself in situations in which he had to behave with dishonesty in order to confront and deal with a situation. So the story of these Sedras of Bereshis, I don't think is that of justifying immorality. It's simply saying that we live in a complicated universe in which sometimes one needs to make morally difficult decisions, and one doesn't always get these decisions right. And if you look in Chazal, there's a lot of discussion around this. I mean, we just read a story this week of a man who is fooled by two sisters, Rachel and Leah, into thinking that one is the other. In last week's Sedra, we read a story of a man who fooled his father into thinking he was his sibling. So we have a parallel between Yaakov fooling his father, living in the darkness of blindness, to think that he was his brother, and Leah fooling her husband Yaakov in the darkness of night into thinking she is her sister. And many Mepharshim point out a midah k'neged midah element to this. There isn't a clean view as to the correctness and incorrectness of behavior in situations of moral dilemma. No one condemns Yaakov as a moral failure. He is absolutely held up to us as a model of moral greatness. Being a model of moral greatness doesn't mean you get every decision right. Many of the Mepharshim, and this is indeed probably pshuto shel mikra if one learns the conversation between Rivka and Yaakov and so on, is that Yaakov dealt with this impossible moral dilemma in which he has to fool his aged father to stop his father doing something that was a mistake, that Yaakov behaved correctly in a very difficult situation. But maybe not. And there's different voices. But the message of the story is not moral relativism of any sort whatsoever. We all know in our care for elderly that there are sometimes situations in which one faces such a decision. What does one do when an elderly person is making decisions which are dangerous, will lead to their humiliation, will lead to a lack of their own rational behavior, a lack of their proper medical care? Do people caring for elderly people never need to blur the situation somewhat in order to deal with what's a very, very difficult and painful stage in life sometimes in their care. These are dilemmas that we are meant to relate to, and I'm not suggesting simplistic answers to them. But one thing I'm saying, if the lesson of these stories of Reishis absolutely is not that anything goes morally. The lesson is we have great moral figures struggling with impossible or very challenging moral situations. How do you deal with an Aesop? How do you deal with a Lovan? How do you address it? And coming to conclusions, which generally speaking are seen as correct, but not necessarily every time do they make the right decision in these challenging circumstances. So this is thoughts around that. I've also been asked here privately, again, about the issue of Aguna, and similarly wiping out the Sheva Canaanite nations, etc. Various aspects of this. This comes from someone called iPhone. I'm not sure who they are, so if they can post to me privately who they are, just be interested. Again, maybe this should be a series of shiurim. In fact, I'm not going to say more about this now because I think this deserves a series of shiurim in its own right as to the morality of the Torah. I'm simply arguing over here that the Torah believes in morality. It believes we should question morality. The fact of the Torah commanding something can swing the moral equation, but nonetheless, perhaps not in an unlimited way. And any section in the Torah in which we find something immoral, we should be bothered by and we should question and try and understand how this is in accordance with morality. Much like Avram did Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Ya'aseh Mishpat. We need moral modesty and a realization that sometimes we may not know the answers to the questions, but I don't mean that's the same as I don't think that's the same as moral surrender. We shouldn't surrender our moral sensibility. We should realize that it's moral modesty. At the end of the day, Avram challenges Hashem, Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Ya'aseh Mishpat, and Hashem answers him by saying there's information you're missing. Hashem answers by saying you have misunderstood the equation. You don't understand what's going on in Sodom. That's also a legitimate answer, that there may be facts that we are missing, and we need to remember that. But nonetheless, the idea that we shouldn't engage in any moral thinking is wrong. The Torah expects us to engage in moral thinking. But by the way, interesting, and I just want to point this out, the Torah explicitly justifies itself in terms of morality. So the Torah says, for example, V'asisa hayashar v'hatoiv. You should do that which is yashar and toiv. The Torah says you should choose tov. You should choose that which is good. So it says that the reason you should keep the Torah is because Hashem is toiv, because Hashem is good. It's the choice of keeping the Torah is because you should choose that which is chayim, that which is life, that which is toiv. So the Torah itself is arguing, follow the system because this will give you access to that which is good. We refer to Hashem by names of morality. Toiv Yotza Kovod Lishmoi. Hashem created the world because it referred to Hashem as Toiv. Toiv, we refer to Hashem as Kel Rachum V'Chanun. He's a merciful God, a kind God. What do any of these terms mean if by definition what he does is that which is moral? So this is just a tautology as opposed to carrying on as carrying any content whatsoever. If Hashem defines by definition that which is good, not as an act of creation woven into the fabric of the universe that he's brought into being, but as by definition, whatever he says is moral, then what does it mean to talk about defining him in terms of goodness? It only carries content if the word has meaning to us. If we human beings can give content to the word, like we can give content to anything else. So if this argument is correct, then we need to ask ourselves the question, what is the authority of the Torah? And the answer to the question is because there is some form of morality that would dictate to us obedience to the Torah, such as acceptance of the Torah, moral commitment, or such as a debt of gratitude which is owed to God, the Creator, or his ownership of the world. Now, given that introduction, we now need to reapproach the question as to the authority and the source of authority of Chazal. Now that we understand that the origin of the Torah authority is something that can be spoken about, we can now try and apply these principles for DeRabbanans themselves. This will await our shir next week. We've run out, unfortunately, of our allotted time, but please God, next week we will have the chance to explore DeRabbanans and bring to a conclusion this topic. And I'm happy after that to look at morality as an independent subject, because I see it's something that people are, correctly so, something that people are interested in. So I'll stop
Thank you.
today and